Jeffrey Rosen, the president of this wonderful institution, the only institution in America chartered by Congress to disseminate information about the US Constitution on a nonpartisan basis. And we are so thrilled to have this treasured mandate and to fulfill it in three ways. As the Museum of We the People, and starting in the fall, we are going to display one of the 12 original copies of the Bill of Rights. As a center for, gasping is right, it's going to be a thrill to see, and we're building a beautiful new gallery with a rare Declaration of Independence and the first public printing of the Constitution, which is why our topic tonight is so incredibly timely. We're also a center for civic education, and we're building the best nonpartisan interactive constitution on the web. And we are America's town hall. We summon the best liberal and conservative minds in the country to debate not political issues, but constitutional issues. And we put the best arguments on both sides and let you, the people, make up your own mind. I can't remember a book that I've been more excited about than the one we're going to talk about tonight. We've had a thrilling range of town hall programs week after week, and you can see them all on the web and come to visit us in the spring. But this book about James Madison was called by Gordon Wood, the Dean of Colonial Historians, in the New York Times last week, the best single-volume biography of James Madison in a generation. Gordon Wood said that not since Professor Ketchum celebrated 1971 biography has there been a book that has captured the father of our Constitution with such rigor and, I will say, having read it, narrative power. This is a page-turner, and you both get a sense of the human being behind this incredible mind that drafted the most beautiful Constitution known to man, and also the ideas. This doesn't stint on the intellectualism of our hero and what he was trying to achieve in drafting the Constitution. So you have a treat in store for you. I'm going to introduce our honored author and my dear friend, Chris Stigall, who's going to kick us off, and we'll begin interviewing Mrs. Cheney, and then I'm going to come back up because I couldn't resist to ask her a few more questions about Madison's role in drafting the Constitution, and then we'll take your questions. So please write them on note cards, and our great town hall staff will bring them up, and we'll have a good Q&A. No big introductions necessary here, except to say that Chris Stigall, who will be interviewing Mrs. Cheney, is such a good friend of the National Constitution Center. He and I, WPHT and the National Constitution Center, have been having a series of town hall debates, interviewing the leading politicians in the country, as well as summoning people to discuss the Constitution over cocktails and conversation. And it's just been a joy to work with Chris, who's got such an impressive background working in Congress as an intern with David Letterman, and just some of the most thoughtful commentary on morning radio. Lynne Cheney, the author of tonight's biography, is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. She was chairman of the National Endowment for the Humanities. She served on the Bicentennial Commission that led to the formation of the National Constitution Center in 1987. She's written 6 books, best-selling history books for children, the most recent one being We the People, The Story of Our Constitution, and she is the rarest of American public intellectuals, someone who combines scholarly rigor with narrative power, and she has produced a really thrilling biography.
I'll ask some of those as we conclude this evening's conversation, but our friend Jeff, I know, has some questions for Mrs. Cheney, so Jeff, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Chris, and thanks for that great conversation. So I am indeed sitting here chomping at the bit, because I think we're about to display one of the 12 original copies of the Bill of Rights, the first public printing of the Constitution. I want everyone here to understand the core of Madison's constitutional thinking, and I think we can do it in just a few minutes. So the first question is, his views on religion evolved. He'd started embracing traditional views on religion, but came to be the author in Virginia of the provision that would have become the American Free Exercise Clause. And you say that he changed his mind partly because of his health and partly because of the Baptist that he met. Tell us about how he changed his mind and what his view on religion came to be.
Well, I think one of the things I've been able to do in this book is explore Madison's health in a way that hasn't been done before. He wrote at the end of his presidency that he had throughout his life been subject to sudden attacks of the nature of epilepsy, that suspended the intellectual functions. And this manuscript in which he wrote this has never been published. I'm sure it will be soon. People have known about it, but I think it's just always been too difficult to explore. And I had a lot of time. So, I worked on this book for 5 years, and I spent a long time taking Madison at his word. Some biographers have dismissed what he said and said, well, he was an hysteric. This doesn't do your political reputation any good, to be called hysterical. But I think that, we need to look at his words and credit them. He never said things lightly. I've talked to experts and read more 18th century health manuals than I like to think about. But it's pretty clear he did have a mild form of epilepsy. And once you grant this idea, you can see where it happened at various stages in his career. It would put him out of action for a day or two at a time. In the 18th century, epilepsy was thought to indicate that you were evil. If you had epilepsy, you were evil. You were full of sin. You were possessed by the devil. And this was widely believed, and a viewpoint that was vigorously defended. Madison, at first, when he had his first attack as an adult, went into this period of deep despondency. But he finally came out of it. He met doctors who urged him to exercise. The founders knew the value of exercise, and he walked and he rode horses. And I think as he did that, he decided that not only would he take his physical health in hand, that he would take his soul in hand as well. And it happened very suddenly. You see this break in his letters, where one day he's being very sad and lugubrious, and in the next, he's talking about religious freedom, freedom of conscience. Nobody should have to believe what he or she doesn't choose to believe. That led him to defend the Baptists in Virginia, who were being persecuted by the Anglican Church, the Church of Virginia. And Madison didn't like Baptists. He said they were too noisy and too opinionated, but boy, did he think that they had the right to believe as they chose to believe and to practice their religion. So he, as much as Jefferson, was, even more than Jefferson, was the defender of religious freedom, which they thought of as intellectual freedom. It's interesting how a person's health, I think, can lead to this kind of great historical contribution.
It's a remarkable combination of biography and intellectual evolution, and you have him drafting the Virginia provision, all men are equally entitled to the free exercise of religion, which ended up in the American First Amendment. Now let's talk about the core evolution of his constitutional thinking. First, tell us, what was it about the Articles of Confederation, that weak union of sovereign states, that troubled Madison, and what evils was he attempting to correct when he drafted the Constitution?
The Articles of Confederation was, in a sense, our first Constitution. It was the first framework for government under which the United States operated. And it really didn't work very well. And that was soon evident to everyone, to Washington especially, who bemoaned that the United States had won its independence and now seemed about to squander it. The states, Madison called them the wicked states. He especially thought Rhode Island was wicked. In Rhode Island, they discriminated against property owners. They coined money left and right. If the government needed money, they just coined some more. And of course, the result of this was inflation. But they also passed a law that anyone who was owed money had to accept this devalued money. So maybe you had lent a fellow $5 when $5 really meant something. But in Rhode Island, they passed a law that said you had to take money that was maybe worth 1 cent as payment for it. There were other states in which there was religious oppression. The states themselves were not behaving in the way members of a republic should, Madison believed. And he thought, from his long reading of history, and he'd begun this project years before, from his long reading of history, that what we needed was a stronger government, a central government that could, make the states behave themselves and make the states quit infringing upon the rights of minorities, including property owners. Madison understood totally that you could not have a stable society if property owners were discriminated against or if property law wasn't stable and steady.
So protecting rights of property was the first object of government, he said. But he had to overcome the conventional wisdom which said you could only have a functioning government in small societies, which was Montesquieu's view. Tell us, Madison read the Scottish Enlightenment, he went to Princeton, and the president of Princeton is an advocate of natural rights theory. What was Madison's great insight about how an extended republic might better protect minority rights than a small state?
Well, first of all, this idea that you could only have a republic, a representative form of government, you could only have it in a really small society where everyone thought alike and believed alike. And Madison's first insight was, well, that's a fiction. Anytime you get three people together, there are going to be differences. And as he continued to ponder this problem, he realized that a big republic was even safer for individual rights than a small one, because in a big republic there would be so many different opinions, so many different interests represented, that no one of them was likely to prevail and oppress the rest. So that, I call Madison a genius in the book, and I think that his genius was in being able to break through conventional wisdom and see in a way that hadn't been seen before. And this was certainly one of his breakthrough thoughts.
And as you say, he embraced the fact that there had been no previous precedents for this, that America was rethinking constitutionalism anew. So they're in the convention, and what was the great debate about the structure of government? Madison thought that proportional representation was important, but the smaller states wanted to be represented in the Senate with one vote each. To tell us about the clash between those views and what Madison thought of the compromise that emerged?
Well, it was a very serious dispute. One of the delegates at the Constitutional Convention, threatened that his state would leave and make alliance with foreign governments. The small states wanted to be represented as states. In other words, if you were Rhode Island, you should get one vote, just as Virginia, which was so much bigger, should get one vote. And Madison thought that was terrible. He was a Virginian, and I'm sure that entered into his thinking. And of course, in the end, they compromised. In the Senate, the states had equal power. In the House of Representatives, a state was empowered according to its population. Madison was very distressed by the compromise. I think he gave serious thought at that point as to whether the Constitution was worth continuing to fight for. I've asked myself, why was Madison so successful as a politician? And one of his rules was, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the possible. He wanted to have proportional representation across the board. But in the end, when that proved not to be possible, he accepted what had happened and moved forward.
The provision of the Constitution that Madison thought was most important never passed. That would have given the federal government a veto over laws passed by the states. And later, when the Bill of Rights was proposed, the amendment Madison thought was most important never passed, and that would have prohibited the states, as well as the federal government, from infringing rights of conscience and other fundamental rights. Why did he think that was so important to give the federal government that?
Well, because he thought the states were wicked, and he thought that the central government should be able to veto a law they might pass that, say, discriminated against property owners. Throughout his long life, the states never had upon them the force of law to protect minority interests. But it finally happened with the 14th Amendment and subsequent jurisprudence on it. The 14th Amendment incorporates most of the Bill of Rights into being necessary for the states. So a state can't prohibit you from free speech any more than the federal government can. It was a dream he had his whole life. It didn't happen until after the Civil War.
So he was obviously not an anti-Federalist and resisted the efforts by people like Patrick Henry and others to propose amendments eliminating the judiciary or limiting the president's power to make war and so forth. But he also was not an advocate of unlimited federal power. He wanted a government that was strong but constrained, and he eventually came to accept the need for a Bill of Rights after having initially dismissed it as either unnecessary because the government was already constrained, or dangerous because it would assume that if the right wasn't written down, it wasn't protected. Tell us more about why Madison changed his mind about the Bill of Rights.
Well, I think he also saw, he was such a good politician. He also saw that if you wanted to bring into the Union states like North Carolina that hadn't ratified the Constitution, and if North Carolina was worried because there was no Bill of Rights, that it was the right thing to reach out and to establish a Bill of Rights that made clear that any right that wasn't mentioned wasn't thereby denied. You don't have to be mentioned in the Bill of Rights in order for something to be your right. I was talking about what a clever politician he was. At one point he wrote to someone that a Bill of Rights will destroy the Federalist Party, and in fact it did. Madison became very disenchanted with the way that government was going, and by establishing a Bill of Rights, he took the main platform of the anti-Federalists, so to speak, the anti-Federalists out from under them. He just pulled the rug right out from under Patrick Henry.
Madison is the principal drafter of the Bill of Rights. How creative an enterprise was it? Did he just cut and paste from the amendments proposed by the states, which in turn were taken from the Revolutionary era state constitutions, or did he put a lot of himself into it?
Madison, I told you, was the hardest working of the founders. He read every bill, every right that had been proposed at various ratifying conventions, and from those took 12, or actually 17, that he thought should be mentioned as amendments. By the time the Congress got through with it, there were 12. By the time the states got through with it, there were 10. But he did look at ones that states had introduced, usually more than one state. He didn't put himself into it so much. He put realism into it. He didn't want any amendments to the Constitution that fundamentally changed what the framers in Philadelphia had agreed on and what the people of the nation had ratified. If he'd done that, you would not have had the same Constitution. So he was clever about it, as he always was. He's a great politician.
And then you saw his political genius in the Virginia ratifying convention, where in the middle of having an epileptic seizure, he actually pulled out a vote that was pretty neck and neck. How did he persuade the skeptics in Virginia to ratify the Constitution? One
of the things I love about Madison is his speaking style. You know, he wasn't histrionic. Patrick Henry liked to yell and gesture, and Madison had adopted the speaking style of the president of Princeton, John Witherspoon. And somebody came across Witherspoon in his garden one day and said, "President Witherspoon, I don't see any flowers in your garden." And Witherspoon said, "No, nor in my oratory either." And that was Madison's style. No flowers, just make the case, sheer reason. And the Virginia ratifying convention was sort of classic. You know, you had the orator with gestures and the man who could call thunder down from the heavens. You had him on one side, you had Madison, cool, composed, countering all the arguments that Henry presented, and I love it that Madison won.
And as if drafting the Constitution and Bill of Rights is not enough, he's one of the principal authors of the Federalist Papers, although Hamilton kind of unkindly tried to take credit for writing more than he actually wrote, which you say Madison never quite liked. But he wrote in a fury, it seems like. And what was the principal contribution, his principal contribution in the Federalist Papers? Well,
Madison was a voice that often echoed off the walls of wherever an assembly was formed. We've talked about how in the early days of the Republic, when the government was just getting underway, George Washington asked Madison to write his inaugural address. Washington had tried someone else as a ghost, and that hadn't worked out. So he got Madison to come to Mount Vernon and write his inaugural address. And then, after Washington delivered it, Madison, who was the leader of the House, wrote the response to Washington's inaugural address that he had written. And then the president asked Madison to write his response back to the House. So you see his ideas bouncing off the wall. The same thing was true at the Virginia ratifying convention. He had written letters to delegates who were going to be there, presenting them with arguments to make at the convention. And of course, he had had a prime hand in writing the Federalist Papers. So again, it was Madison's arguments coming out of the mouths of different people that just echoed and re-echoed through the building on Shockoe Hill in Richmond, where the convention met. It was an extraordinary performance.
And the force of intellectual persuasion. He convinced skeptics, like even Jefferson on some points, by the power of his arguments. Why is he not more appreciated today?
You know, I wonder if part of it isn't his reserve. I used to be a student of British literature, and one of the great questions of British literature is why, in Milton's play Paradise Lost, why is the devil so much more interesting than God? And you know, it's sort of a question that gets to the fact that we like our villains. You know, the people who follow the straight and narrow path perhaps aren't always. I don't know. They don't intrigue us quite as much. So maybe the fact that Madison was a reserved fellow, had no scandals in his life, maybe that has in fact been a little bit a detriment to his career. I think he was also unlucky in having Henry Adams for one of his early biographers. You know, Henry Adams was sort of perpetually grumpy. And when he looked at Madison's administrations, he wrote 2 volumes, one for the first 4 years and one for the second. He presented Madison as his worst enemy might have. And Adams was an enormously influential figure and a really good writer. So I think that also had some impact. He deserved a better biographer. He's had many good ones since, and I hope that all of us together can perhaps give Madison the due that he should have.
Henry Adams obviously was working out his vendetta against Jefferson because of his affection for his relative John Adams, but why he went after Madison is, well, why did he go after Madison?
Well, it's interesting. You know, Madison and Jefferson were so close. It was a lifelong friendship that was really very touching when you read about it. But Madison, for a long time, was sort of Jefferson's lieutenant. Some wag called Jefferson the generalissimo and Madison the general. You know, he was the aide on whom you blamed everything. When Jefferson was president and Madison was Secretary of State, the things just keep happening again and again. There was a conservative movement within the party that decided that Secretary Madison was the evil genius behind Thomas Jefferson. And they blamed everything on Madison and just assumed that he was manipulating Jefferson. We've seen this happen so many times in our history. If you think about it, it's a really good political move. You demonize the guy who's getting things done, and you make the president he's getting things done for appear weak. So, you know, that was their connection. Interestingly, though, John Adams, Henry's, grandfather, great-grandfather?
Charles Francis, it would be his great-grandfather, because
John Adams, Henry Adams' great-grandfather, said that Madison had, in his administration, covered himself with more glory than any of his predecessors. Now, his predecessors were Washington, Jefferson, and Adams himself. So that was amazing praise. Figuring out Henry's psychological impulses is hard.
And the education of Henry Adams gives some sense of that. Jefferson and Madison, I'll ask about that, and we'll get to your questions as soon as they are brought up. So Madison writes the Federalist Papers, champions of powerful but limited federal government, writes the Bill of Rights, and then co-founds with Jefferson the Democratic Republican Party in opposition to the Federalists, which seems to champion states' rights, writes the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions criticizing the Adams administration for violating liberties. Did he become more of a anti-Federalist, Tea Party Republican, whatever you will, or was it still a sign of the balance that he displayed throughout his career?
Well, it was again an example of when the circumstances change, you're foolish if you don't change your approach. And the circumstances changed. He ran into Alexander Hamilton in full force. Hamilton wanted a far-reaching government. He wanted a government that could do anything that was deemed to be within the general welfare. Madison knew that wasn't what had been created in Philadelphia. So he, in the day when parties were despised, he started a political party with the idea in mind of defeating this idea. And when he saw Hamilton arguing for this government that Madison believed would be even tyrannical, he shifted his thinking to the idea that we needed to protect people from the government. And that was a large part of the motivation.
That's a beautiful way of putting it. It wasn't intellectual inconsistency, but flexibility that led him pragmatically to adapt his ideas to these new circumstances. This is superb. Of course, I could go on all night, but our audience has great questions. Chris, let me just ask two, and then you can
Sure.
Take it away.
By the way, how about a hand for Mrs. Cheney tonight?
Thank you.
Superb. What would Madison say is the greatest threat to our country's ability to survive and prosper in 2014?
The size of government. He would totally understand that as the nation has grown, the government will grow. But to see, I just try to imagine him driving through Washington, D.C. and seeing tall building after tall building full of people who were, interested in your tax records, for example. The government, in his view, he would have thought it had grown too large. He also would have said, though, that if you don't like it, fix it. It's a government of we the people. If you don't like what the party in power is doing, organize. Get your own political party moving in the right direction. That's the essence of a republic. When you don't like what the government's doing, work to change it. And so I don't think he would be totally discouraged. He would be just dismayed.
And along those lines, how would you compare the statesman like Madison and his contemporaries to the statesmen of today, excluding, of course, your husband?
They were so lucky to live in the time in which they did. In many ways, it was a difficult time, medically, for example. But to be alive and involved in creating the greatest nation that had ever been created, a nation where people would be free, a nation where people could determine their own fate and flourish. I think that I've said before that there are some rules you can turn to when you talk about Madison's success, but one of them was to be lucky. He was lucky to be born in the time in which he was, and they all knew that they were making history. They all knew that what they were doing was world-changing. Before, people had never really thought about a large republic where people could elect their representatives to make decisions. They'd never even thought that was possible. And suddenly, Madison, in particular, made that a possibility and opened up the potential of freedom around the world.
Wonderful. Take it away, Chris.
Yeah, I think that's actually a remarkable point you make. That, as I had mentioned earlier, that is heavy reading, the case he made for the foundational principles of our country. Were we a more engaged, educated public once upon a time than we are now?
Well, we weren't so widely educated. One of the causes that both Jefferson and Madison took up was to have schools where all kids could go and learn to read and write. Because the educated class was very small, it was very highly educated. I talked to a college group recently, and the Federalist Papers came up, and this is what's amazing to me. In terms of these college students, Madison wrote, during this one frantic period of getting the Federalist Papers out, he wrote the equivalent of a 10-page paper every other day for more than a month. Now, okay, that in itself is pretty stunning, but what he wrote became immortal.
Yeah.
Now, I could turn out the 10-page paper maybe, but no, it wouldn't be the Federalist Papers. It was an amazing accomplishment.
Cole wanted to know, could you elaborate on the story about James Callender and the no secrets from Madison aspect? Sally Hemings, he writes in parentheses. Could you elaborate on that story?
Well, the Hamilton scandal was an example of how vitriolic politics could be in the 18th and early 19th century matched anything going on in our own time. The politics of personal destruction is what I call it. You know, you dig into somebody's past and you find that nasty secret and you put it out. James Callender was sort of a professional scandal monger. He made his money by telling other people's secrets. The secret that he told about Hamilton, though, went this way. Our Treasury Secretary is giving money to this shady character so that the shady character will speculate for him. In other words, the Treasury Secretary, who knew where things were going and what was going to be up and what was going to be down, was speculating through this shady character. Well, Hamilton had a highly developed sense of honor. And so he himself wrote a pamphlet in which he said, I am not a speculator, I'm an adulterer. I was sleeping with the guy's wife.
Well,
but, you know, everyone, I think, in the who read Hamilton's pamphlet said, you know, what?
Another audience member wanted to know about Madison's relationship with Francis Scott Key.
Well, I don't know that it was close, but of course, Francis Scott Key, after the British burned Washington, they turned their eye on Baltimore, which in many ways was a more important strategic target. Washington had just 8,000 people, I think. Baltimore was much more of a city and important militarily. The British did not succeed. They bombarded Fort McHenry. They had these things called Congreve rockets. They're a little like Scud missiles. You know, you set them off, they scare everybody. They might occasionally kill someone, but mostly they terrorize people. So the British were shooting their Congreve rockets, the rockets' red glare. They were bombs bursting in air, and Francis Scott Key was on a ship where he had gone to try to get a prisoner of war freed. He had succeeded, but the British wouldn't let him leave the ship until after the Battle of Baltimore was over. So in that successful American effort, he wrote the words that later became set to music and that we know as the Star-Spangled Banner.
How much influence did George Mason have on James Madison?
Well, George Mason was, a heavy-duty, an important person, and he has an interesting life story. He didn't go to college, but he read so wisely that he was very knowledgeable. He had 9 or 10 children, and his wife died, and he turned down many opportunities for public service because he thought his children needed him. You don't run across that often in the 18th century. So he sort of won a place in my heart with that. Mason and Madison did not see eye to eye in the beginning because Mason was much more conservative, much more states-oriented than Madison. After Madison saw what Hamilton was doing to government and perceived that the hope for salvation lay with the states, he and Mason, they didn't become close, but before Mason died, he said some very kind things about Madison.
And Daniel had asked also from Haverford, and I apologize, Daniel, my writing's no better, so it's a bit like a doctor here. But I think you're asking about real estate, qualifying as a voter and real estate at that time and what that meant in terms of Hamilton. And does that make sense to you? I'm trying to, as best I can, read this. I'm sorry, Daniel. I don't mean to embarrass you. I'm just trying to get your question asked. Voting for the Constitution and in terms of where you lived and ownership of real estate, I believe is what Daniel's asking. Does that make sense to you?
It probably would if it were the beginning of this program.
My apologies, Daniel. I didn't mean to butcher your question. I know Mrs. Cheney would love to sign your book, and you can ask it in person. Anyway, it is 7:30, which means I want to make sure we have plenty of time for everybody to get their autograph. So, ladies and gentlemen, please, a warm welcome again for Mrs. Cheney.
And I'd just like to conclude by saying that you're very lucky to live within close distance of this marvelous institution. It is a real gift, not just for Philadelphia, but for the country as a whole, to have a place that's centered on education about the Constitution. And I'm very honored to have been here, and I appreciate your joining us tonight.
She'll head out to the Overlook for signatures, so if you'll excuse us for just a little bit, we'll break, and she'll meet you out in the Overlook for an autograph. Thanks for coming out tonight.
Great.
Drive safe.